Inflation has been a growing concern for the average person because it means the purchasing power of their money is shrinking day by day. The Chief Economist of the Bank of England, Huw Pill, recently caused a lot of anger by saying that we should simply accept the fact that we're now poorer. However, is this a good solution to ending this period of high inflation? So in this video, I look at how high inflation got started in the first place, but also the unpleasant truth about how such periods of high inflation usually end. Now remember, if you do enjoy our content, please do subscribe to our channel and like this video. So let's look at this period of high inflation and how it's likely to end in a bit more detail. This message from the Bank of England has certainly been a bitter pill to swallow. So here's a bit of rage from the Daily Mail in the UK, which says fury as the 190,000 a year bank chief tells the rest of us, you need to accept you're poorer. But this is nothing new. For example, the Bank of England Governor, Andrew Bailey, also recently said that you shouldn't ask for a big pay rise. So what the Bank of England is trying to avoid here is a price-wage spiral, where prices chase wages and wages chase prices, because that's how inflation becomes ingrained. That's the message they're trying to convey. I just think they've done a very poor job in doing it in a sensitive way, particularly when people are really struggling with the cost of living increases that we're seeing right now. So what did Huw Pill actually say that caused such anger? Well, it was for a US-based podcast called Beyond Unprecedented, and I'll be quoting from that here. But you can see the primary problem here beside me, which is the average cost of energy bills in the UK. Those have increased hugely over the course of just 1 year. And in the podcast, Huw Pill said when your energy bill, which you get every month at your house, goes up 4 or 5 times, that's eating into your income. What's the natural thing to do? Well, the natural thing to do is to say, I need to be paid more. So you can see how in a perfectly reasonable way, a price-wage spiral starts. But it's not just to do with households, it's also to do with businesses. So let's imagine you're a restaurant, and here I have some fabulous UK cuisine beside me, fish and chips. And Huw Pill goes on to say, what's the natural thing to do if you're a restaurant? The natural thing to do is to say, I need to raise the prices of my meals in order to compensate for the fact that my gas bill is now higher. Again, a completely reasonable response to the increasing energy cost. And if we look at the UK as a whole, we're a very large importer of natural gas. That supplies a lot of our energy, both for domestic and industrial use. And yet as an exporter, we produce a lot of services. Now the price of those inputs, the natural gas, have increased a lot, whereas the price of the services which we produce haven't. And as Huw Pill says, you don't have to be much of an economist to realize that if what you're buying has gone up a lot relative to what you're selling, you're going to be worse off. So this is the statement which caused all of the anger. And you can see Huw Pill beside me here in the FT. And what he says is that somehow in the UK, someone needs to accept that they're worse off and stop trying to maintain their real spending power by bidding up prices, whether that's higher wages, that's for individuals, or passing the energy costs through onto customers, so that's companies. And he also likens it to a game of pass the parcel. That pass the parcel game that's going on here, he says, that game is one that's generating inflation, and that part of inflation can persist. So the key question here is, how do we break this loop between rising prices, rising wages, and high margins at companies? Because if we don't, inflation's going to remain high. And I think we can learn a lot if we look back to the high inflation episode in the UK from the late 70s and early 80s. Now, what really kicked off inflation that time around, which is kind of similar to this time, was a big spike in the price of energy. So if we look at the year-on-year increase in the energy price, you can see in 1973 there was a huge spike. This was around 500%. And then there was a secondary spike in 1979. Below that, you can see the rate of inflation, and that peaks just after the spike in energy. And that happened twice. So what really got the inflation ball rolling was the oil crises. And that wasn't just a UK phenomenon, it was a global phenomenon. At the same time, we also got rising food and commodity prices. And that was partly because Russia started increasing its grain imports, as did other centrally planned economies, And this was just at the end of the Bretton Woods period, which was a period when sterling was devaluing very rapidly, so the cost of imports were actually higher. So, for example, energy is priced in dollars, and if sterling's weakening, that pass-through inflation increases the cost of energy for UK consumers. If you want to learn how to invest through these periods of economic crisis with high inflation, low growth, and so on, then a great way to do that is as part of the PensionCraft community. We have lots of members-only content, and you can vote on new content. Plus, we have access to macroeconomic tools, but also market tools, so you can monitor what's going on all the time. And you can chat to other members of the community with our chat application, including me. If you want to learn more about that, just go to the link in the description beneath me or our website, PensionCraft.com. So how does a period of really high inflation usually end? Well, one of the problems at the moment is that unemployment is so low. So in the UK and elsewhere, there's a really tight labour market. If we look at the unemployment rate today, you'd have to go back 50 years to see a comparable level. Now, it may seem odd to say that low unemployment is a problem, but what it means when inflation does spike is that wage bargaining power is very high. If you can just walk off into another job, then you've got a lot of confidence when it comes to negotiating your wages. Now, if we go back to the 1970s, and here I'm looking at three variables, I'm looking at retail price inflation. Here's the triple spike, which we saw in the late 70s and early 80s. But you can also see these blue shaded regions, and those are UK recessions. In the middle panel, you can see UK unemployment, and you can see how at the beginning of that inflationary period, as it is now, unemployment was very low. And you can also see the value of sterling, which depreciated in 2 episodes in the late 70s and early 80s. But notice that what happens is that when we get a recession in the UK, unemployment increases, so that tight labour market ends. But what also happens is that inflation falls, and that's because demand is falling. Now, one of the problems that the UK faced in the 70s was a weakening currency because of that pass-through effect, which increased inflation. In the UK as well, we've seen sterling weaken recently, and that was a problem for a while, although it now seems that sterling has now stabilised. But as the Bank of England increases interest rates, that should hopefully also reverse that weakening of sterling. But make no mistake, when the Bank of England raises its policy rate, when they talk about things like cooling demand, that's just a code word which means job loss. So if we zoom in on the 1970s and 80s inflation period, notice how much unemployment increased through that kind of triple recession period. We went from an unemployment rate which is comparable to where it is now to an unemployment rate which was well above 10%. Now, of course, the bank wants to avoid that. It doesn't want to create a recession. It wants to try and bring down demand. But the unfortunate consequence is that usually means lots of job losses and it means a recession. So how does this monetary policy tool of increasing interest rates work? Well, in the UK, the policy rate's called bank rate, and that's gone up hugely over the last year or so. The most obvious effect of that is that it increases the cost of borrowing. That's both for households, but also for companies. In the case of households, what it means is that if they're borrowing money, say via a mortgage, then their disposable income will fall as their debt servicing cost increases on their mortgage. If households have less disposable income, then that reduces demand for goods and services. And certainly for domestic companies, that means a fall in corporate profit, both in terms of revenue, the top line, but also margins, because companies aren't going to be able to maintain high margins and pass on prices to customers if they've got less money to spend. That also means if companies have lower profits, they've got less money to pay out in the form of dividends. In the UK market, for the UK stock market, that's a real problem because the party trick that UK stocks have are those high dividends. Now, if there's falling demand for the goods and services produced by companies, they're not going to need so many staff. So what usually happens is that unemployment increases. Now, that's usually synonymous with a recession. So this is how an increasing bank rate often leads to recession. But there are also other effects. Increasing short-term interest rates makes borrowing less attractive, so mortgages become more expensive and house prices usually fall, but saving becomes more attractive, and that's because short-term interest rates increase. and money you have in savings accounts will generate a greater amount of interest. But as we've seen in the United States, growth stocks in particular have seen a big tumble in prices. So higher interest rates usually push down the value of assets, and particularly growth stocks. Now, another effect of increasing the interest rate in the UK relative to elsewhere is that it tends to strengthen sterling. That's good news for the UK, partly because it means that our energy imports, which are priced in dollars, become cheaper. So that pass-through effect is going to reduce inflation. Unfortunately, it also means our exports become less attractive because they become more expensive in foreign currency. The final effect is a psychological one, which is that when the bank increases interest rates, it makes business confidence reduce and it makes consumer confidence reduce. And at the margin, that makes people and companies less likely to spend. So all in all, what we've got here is a recipe for recession. Our jobs become less secure and also growth reduces. So this is not a pleasant scenario, but this is how periods of high inflation usually end. So I don't think there's any way to sugarcoat it. The process by which high inflation ends is usually a painful one. Weak growth, more job insecurity, that's how we usually get there. But I think the Bank of England has done a very poor job of messaging this, and simply creating this clickbait for tabloids is not the right way to go about it. Explain the transmission mechanisms, that would be a better use of their time. Now, don't forget, if you do enjoy our content, we have our offer of membership. To learn more about that, just go to the link in the description beneath me or our website, PensionCraft.com, to see all the goodies you'll get access to. And, as always, thank you for listening.